February 17, 1944, 4:30 in the morning. Vice Admiral Marc Mitscher stood on the bridge of the carrier Yorktown, his weathered face barely visible in the pre-dawn darkness. Around him, the Pacific swells rolled in endless procession, their rhythm unchanged by the momentous events about to unfold. Behind Yorktown, stretching across miles of dark ocean, 5 fleet carriers and 4 light carriers maintained perfect formation. The sight would have been breathtaking in daylight. Each massive flight deck carried 90 aircraft, fueled, armed, and ready. Below those decks, another 800 fighters and bombers waited in the hangars. Mitscher checked his watch. In 2 hours, he would launch the largest carrier strike in naval history. The target lay 120 miles to the southwest, Truk Lagoon. The Japanese called it the Gibraltar of the Pacific, their Pearl Harbor in the Central Pacific. American intelligence reports estimated 40,000 Japanese troops defended the atoll, supported by over 200 aircraft operating from 4 airfields. The lagoon itself housed what remained of the combined fleet's forward operating force, protected by massive coastal guns and interconnected defense systems that had taken 2 decades to perfect. But Mitscher would not land a single Marine on Truk's beaches. He would not storm its fortifications. He would not sacrifice thousands of American lives in the kind of bloody assault that had characterized warfare since humans first learned to fight. Instead, over the next 48 hours, he would demonstrate a revolutionary form of warfare that would shock the Japanese high command and fundamentally rewrite every assumption about how modern wars must be fought. The attack on Truk would prove that heavily fortified enemy bases could be neutralized without ever being captured. And the Japanese admirals who had built their entire defensive strategy around making Americans pay in it, blood for every island, would watch that strategy collapse in a single weekend. The story of how America reached this moment begins not with Mitscher's carriers, but with an impossible problem. In 1943, the United States faced a strategic nightmare that seemed to have no solution. Between Hawaii and the Philippines stretched 3,000 miles of ocean, and scattered across that vast expanse lay hundreds of Japanese-held islands. Many of these positions had been fortified for 2 decades, ever since Japan acquired them under League of Nations mandate after World War I. The Japanese had used those 20 years well, turning remote atolls into fortresses that bristled with coastal artillery, housed tens of thousands of troops in concrete bunkers and interconnected tunnel systems, and operated airfields that could project Japanese air power across enormous distances. Truk Lagoon alone represented a concentration of force that would have given any military planner nightmares. 40,000 Japanese troops called it home, though the exact number fluctuated depending on which fleet elements happened to be in port. 4 airfields operated over 200 aircraft at any given time. The lagoon itself was enormous, large enough to anchor the entire combined fleet with room to spare, and protected by a barrier reef that made direct naval bombardment nearly impossible. The Japanese hadn't just fortified Truk, they had turned it into a self-sustaining military ecosystem, capable of supporting major fleet operations thousands of miles from Japan itself. And Truk wasn't even the most heavily defended position the Americans would need to overcome. Rabaul on New Britain housed 110,000 Japanese soldiers in what had become the South Pacific's most formidable fortress. The Japanese had been improving Rabaul's defenses since 1942, and by 1943 it featured multiple airfields, extensive tunnel networks carved into volcanic rock, massive ammunition and supply dumps, and defensive positions that had been planned and refined with meticulous Japanese attention to detail. Wake Island, seized from the Americans in the war's opening days, now held 4,000 defenders who had spent 2 years preparing for the inevitable American attempt to take it back. Woolley, Ponape, Kusai, and dozens of smaller atolls each contained garrisons of thousands of troops, all protected by concrete bunkers, coastal artillery, and interconnected tunnel systems that would make any assault a nightmare of close-quarters combat. Japanese military planners had looked at this defensive perimeter and made a calculation that seemed unassailable. The Americans would have to assault each position in sequence. Geography and logistics left them no choice. Each fortress would exact its price in American blood, and those prices would add up. The mathematics seemed irrefutable. By the time American forces fought their way to the Philippines, the Marine Corps might cease to exist as a fighting force. The American public, watching casualty lists grow longer with each island assault, might lose the will to continue. Japan couldn't win the war through military victory anymore. The losses at Midway and Guadalcanal had destroyed that possibility, but they could make victory so expensive that America would accept a negotiated peace, leaving Japan with at least some of its conquests intact. Then came Tarawa, and the mathematics became horrifyingly specific. In November 1943, the 2nd Marine Division assaulted Betio Island in Tarawa Atoll, part of the Gilbert Islands. Betio measured just 2 miles long and 800 yards wide, a tiny strip of coral barely visible above the Pacific's waves. But 4,500 Japanese defenders had transformed that tiny island into the most heavily fortified position in the Pacific. They had built hundreds of pillboxes from coconut logs and concrete, each one positioned to create interlocking fields of fire. They had installed coastal artillery and anti-aircraft guns in reinforced positions. They had seeded the beaches with mines and obstacles, and they had dug themselves into positions so well constructed that even sustained naval bombardment barely touched them. Colonel David Shoup's Marines waded ashore on November 20th, 1943, and walked into hell. The pre-assault bombardment, which was supposed to have destroyed Japanese defenses, had barely scratched them. Marines found themselves pinned down on narrow beaches, taking fire from positions they couldn't even see. The landing craft grounded on reefs hundreds of yards offshore, forcing men to wade through chest-deep water, while Japanese machine gunners methodically cut them down. Those who made it to the beach found themselves trapped against a seawall, unable to advance, taking casualties from artillery and mortar fire that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The battle consumed 76 hours of the most savage fighting in Marine Corps history. 76 hours of attacking concrete bunkers with flamethrowers and explosives. 76 hours of close-quarters combat in confined spaces where every Japanese defender fought to the death. 76 hours of trying to advance across a killing ground where every yard gained cost American lives. When it ended, American casualties reached 3,166, including over 1,000 dead. The Japanese lost their entire garrison. Every single defender died. Only 17 prisoners were taken, most of them laborers, not combat troops. Military planners looked at those numbers and performed grim calculations. If Tarawa's ratio held, capturing Rabaul would cost 50,000 American casualties. Taking Truk might demand 20,000. The island chain stretching to the Philippines could consume the entire Marine Corps, and there would still be heavily defended positions left to assault. The path to Tokyo seemed to lead through an endless series of Tarawas, each one paid for in American blood, each one bringing victory measurably closer, but at a cost that might become unbearable. Admiral Chester William Nimitz commanded the Pacific Fleet from his headquarters at Pearl Harbor. At 58 years old, the Texas-born officer had spent his entire career preparing for exactly this kind of strategic challenge. He understood naval warfare. He understood logistics. He understood the capabilities and limitations of every ship, aircraft, and weapon system in his arsenal. But conventional wisdom offered him only one path forward. Storm each island, pay the price, advance slowly toward Japan. Except that American mothers would receive telegram after telegram informing them their sons had died taking some coral atoll most of them had never heard of. Nimitz's staff officers expected exactly that approach. His Marine commanders, still analyzing lessons from Tarawa, were already planning the next assault. Admiral Ernest King in Washington was pushing for continued offensive operations, whatever the cost. Everyone assumed the war would continue exactly as it had begun. Identify the next objective. Mass overwhelming force. Launch the assault. Count the casualties. Move on to the next target. But Nimitz looked at the map differently. He saw those heavily fortified Japanese bases and asked a question that seemed almost heretical to traditional military thinking. What if they weren't obstacles to overcome? What if they were irrelevances to bypass? What if carrier air power had reached a capability level where it could neutralize island garrisons without invasion? What if American forces only needed to strike the strategic positions that truly mattered while leaving everything else to wither under blockade. The concept violated every military instinct developed over centuries of warfare. Armies captured territory. Navies controlled sea lanes. You secured your rear areas before advancing. You didn't leave tens of thousands of enemy troops behind your lines, threatening your supply routes and forcing you to garrison positions to watch them. The idea seemed to contradict everything military science taught about how wars must be fought. But Nimitz began to see another possibility emerging from the chaos of the Pacific War. You could leave enemy troops behind your lines if they posed no threat. You could isolate them if you controlled the sea and air around them so completely that they couldn't project power beyond their immediate position. You could let them starve if you cut their supply lines and prevented reinforcement or resupply. And you could do all of that while advancing your own timetable toward Japan by months or even years, saving thousands of American lives in the process. The question wasn't whether the strategy would work in theory. The question was whether the new fast carrier task forces possessed the power to execute such a strategy in practice. Could carrier air power really substitute for amphibious assault? Could carriers operating thousands of miles from friendly bases maintain the sustained pressure necessary to keep bypassed garrisons neutralized? Could the United States Navy protect those carriers and keep them supplied while they operated in waters where Japanese land-based air power could reach them? The answer to all those questions depended on a man Nimitz had just appointed to command the Pacific Fleet's primary striking force. In January 1944, Vice Admiral Marc Mitscher assumed command of Task Force 58. At 57, Mitscher was one of naval aviation's true pioneers. The Navy had designated him Aviator Number 33 back in June 1916, when aircraft carriers were still theoretical concepts, and naval aviation meant rickety biplanes operating from improvised platforms. Mitscher had commanded the carrier Hornet during Jimmy Doolittle's famous raid on Tokyo in April 1942, launching Army B-25 bombers from his deck in an operation that proved carriers could strike targets previously thought safe from naval attack. He had fought at Midway, where carrier aviation had sunk 4 Japanese carriers and turned the tide of the Pacific War. Mitscher understood carrier warfare better than any admiral in the world, and he was about to prove that carrier aviation had reached a capability that made the old amphibious warfare calculations obsolete. Task Force 58 represented a concentration of naval power unprecedented in human history. By June 1944, Mitscher commanded 7 fleet carriers, 8 light carriers, 7 fast battleships, 21 cruisers, and 70 destroyers. The numbers alone were staggering, but they only began to tell the story of what Task Force 58 could accomplish. The Essex-class fleet carriers that formed the task force's backbone displaced 27,100 tons, reached speeds of 33 knots, and carried over 90 aircraft each. These weren't the converted hulls and compromised designs that had characterized early American carrier construction. The Essex class represented purpose-built fleet carriers, designed from the keel up to Project Air Power across vast distances. Their flight decks could launch and recover aircraft in conditions that would have grounded earlier carriers. Their aviation fuel storage, ammunition magazines, and maintenance facilities allowed sustained operations that previous carrier designs simply couldn't match. The Independence-class light carriers added flexibility in numbers to Mitscher's force. Converted from cruiser hulls, these ships carried 30 aircraft each while maintaining speeds of 31 knots. They weren't as capable as the fleet carriers, but they dramatically increased the number of aircraft Mitscher could put in the air at any given time. And in carrier warfare, the ability to put up overwhelming numbers of fighters and bombers often mattered more than individual ship capabilities. Together, Task Force 58 operated nearly 1,000 aircraft. To put that in perspective, the entire Japanese carrier force that attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, had operated about 400 aircraft. Mitscher commanded 2.5 times that force, supported by radar-directed fighter control, vastly superior pilot training, and logistical capabilities that allowed his carriers to remain at sea indefinitely. But numbers alone didn't explain the revolution Mitscher brought to carrier warfare. He had developed tactical doctrine that transformed how carrier task forces operated. His formations used circular defensive screens, where supporting vessels contributed overlapping anti-aircraft fire that created nearly impenetrable defensive barriers. Radar-directed combat air patrol fighters could intercept threats 50 miles from the fleet, destroying enemy bombers before they ever saw an American ship. Multiple carrier groups could coordinate their attacks, launching strikes so massive that they overwhelmed any land-based air defense through sheer numbers and timing. And most revolutionary of all, Mitscher demonstrated that his fast carriers could remain at sea indefinitely through underway replenishment. Previous carrier operations had been limited by fuel, ammunition, and supplies. Carriers would sortie, conduct operations for a few days or weeks, then return to port to refuel and rearm. This pattern gave Japanese defenders predictable windows when they knew American carriers wouldn't threaten them. Mitscher shattered that predictability. His carriers could refuel at sea from oilers, take on ammunition from supply ships, replace damaged aircraft from escort carriers serving as aircraft ferries, and even conduct routine maintenance and repairs without returning to port. The operational tempo this enabled was something Japanese planners had never anticipated and couldn't counter. The strategy Nimitz had conceived now had the weapon it required. In late 1943 and early 1944, the combination of bypass warfare and carrier supremacy transformed the Pacific Campaign in ways that shocked Japanese commanders, who had assumed their fortified perimeter would delay American advances for years. Operation Flintlock in late January 1944 demonstrated the new approach. Nimitz's staff had recommended seizing the heavily defended outer atolls of Woche and Maloelap first, exactly as conventional military doctrine prescribed. You secure your flanks, you eliminate threats to your supply lines, you don't leave enemy forces in your rear areas. The staff's recommendation made perfect sense according to every principle taught at every war college. Nimitz overruled them all. He ordered an assault directly on Kwajalein Atoll at the center of the Marshall Islands chain while bypassing the outer atolls entirely. 13,700 Japanese troops on Woche, Maloelap, Mili, and Jaluit suddenly became strategically irrelevant. They posed no threat to American operations at Kwajalein. They couldn't interfere with the assault. They couldn't reinforce the defenders. They couldn't even reliably report on American movements because carrier air power kept them suppressed and isolated. American forces seized Kwajalein for 177 killed. Approximately 4,800 Japanese defenders died. The contrast with Tarawa couldn't have been starker. Refined doctrine, extended naval bombardment, carrier air superiority, and lessons learned about reef conditions had produced a 27-to-1 kill ratio compared to Tarawa's nearly even exchange. The Marines had learned from their mistakes. The Navy had learned to use carrier air power more effectively, and Nimitz had demonstrated that bypassing heavily defended positions could work. The bypassed garrisons received continuous airstrikes but no invasion. American carrier aircraft and long-range bombers from newly captured bases hit them repeatedly, destroying supplies, damaging facilities, and preventing any Japanese attempts to break out or interfere with American operations. The garrisons couldn't threaten American ships because carrier air power and submarine patrols controlled the surrounding waters. Their supplies dwindled. Disease spread through overcrowded positions designed to support specific garrison sizes, not the numbers actually present. Medical supplies ran low. Food stocks diminished. By war's end, 7,440 of those 13,700 men had died. 54% mortality from a siege that cost American forces 0 ground casualties. But Kwajalein represented only the opening move. The true test of the bypass strategy came at Truk Lagoon in mid-February 1944. The Japanese had developed Truk as their Pearl Harbor in the Central Pacific, a massive naval base in the Caroline Islands, serving as the combined fleet's main forward operating position. The base housed between 24,000 and 40,000 troops, depending on fleet presence. Over 200 aircraft operated from 4 airfields. Japanese propaganda called it the Gibraltar of the Pacific, implying impregnability. American planners had estimated that capturing Truk would require a major amphibious operation, potentially costing tens of thousands of casualties. The island's terrain favored defenders. The reef system would complicate any landing. The garrison had spent years preparing defensive positions. Everything about Truk suggested it would be another Tarawa, only larger and bloodier. Nimitz and Mitscher planned something entirely different. On February 17, 1944, Task Force 58 arrived northeast of Truk. Mitscher commanded 3 of his 4 carrier groups, comprising 5 fleet carriers, 4 light carriers, 7 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 28 destroyers. At 0430 hours, the launch order went out. 72 fighters roared off the carrier decks 90 minutes before dawn. The timing was crucial. Mitscher wanted his fighters over Truk just as dawn broke, catching Japanese defenders before they were fully awake, before their aircraft could scramble, before their anti-aircraft crews reached full manning. The fighter sweep arrived exactly as planned. Japanese sentries were still rubbing sleep from their eyes when American Hellcats appeared overhead. The fighters established complete air superiority before most enemy aircraft could even start their engines. Japanese pilots who did manage to get airborne found themselves outnumbered, outperformed, and fighting against pilots who had hundreds more hours of training and combat experience. Then the bombers came, wave after wave. Dive bombers targeting ships in the anchorage, their bombs screaming down from altitudes that made anti-aircraft fire ineffective. Torpedo planes hunting major vessels, their weapons calibrated to run shallow in the lagoon's protected waters. Fighters strafing the airfields, destroying parked aircraft that represented easier targets than trying to shoot them down in air combat. Level bombers hitting supply dumps, fuel storage facilities, repair facilities, anything that kept Truk functioning as a forward base. Over 2 days, American carrier aircraft flew 1,250 combat sorties. 400 tons of bombs fell on shipping in the lagoon. 94 tons hit land targets. The devastation exceeded even Mitscher's projections, and his projections had been optimistic. Light cruisers Naka and Katori went to the bottom, their crews barely having time to man battle stations, before torpedoes ripped through their hulls. Destroyers Maikaze, Fumizuki, Oidi, and Tachikaze exploded and sank, victims of bombs, torpedoes, and the confined waters that left them nowhere to maneuver. The submarine tender Heian Maru, displacing 11,614 tons, took multiple bomb hits and capsized, carrying tons of submarine supplies to the bottom. The massive whaler and oiler Tonin Maru No. 3, displacing 19,209 tons, became the largest ship sunk during the raid. A loss that would seriously complicate Japanese refueling operations throughout the Central Pacific. Total shipping losses approached 200,000 tons. To put that in perspective, that represented 10% of all Japanese shipping, destroyed in the entire 6-month period from November 1943 to June 1944. In 2 days of airstrikes, Mitscher's carriers had inflicted shipping losses equal to a month and a half of submarine operations across the entire Pacific theater. Between 250 and 275 Japanese aircraft were destroyed on the ground or shot down. American losses totaled 40 men killed and 25 aircraft lost. The carrier Intrepid took a torpedo hit but remained operational. Testimony to American damage control capabilities and the robust construction of Essex-class carriers. For the cost of one damaged carrier, Mitscher had eliminated Truk as a functioning naval base. The Japanese withdrew their remaining fleet units immediately. The garrison was left to starve. Admiral Masami Kobayashi, who commanded the 4th Fleet base at Truk, was relieved of command 2 days after the attack. The Joint Chiefs of Staff formally decided on March 12, 1944, that Truk would never be invaded. 40,000 Japanese troops would spend the rest of the war under blockade, slowly dying of disease and malnutrition, while threatening no American operations whatsoever. The Gibraltar of the Pacific had fallen without a single American Marine setting foot on its beaches. The same pattern repeated across the Central Pacific. Rabaul on New Britain had housed 110,000 Japanese troops in what had become the South Pacific's most formidable fortress. Rather than assault it, American and Australian forces simply isolated it through naval blockade and continuous airstrikes. Carrier raids and long-range bomber attacks from captured bases hit Rabaul repeatedly, destroying aircraft, damaging facilities, and making life miserable for the garrison. But no invasion came. By war's end, over 90,000 Japanese troops remained on Rabaul, having fired not a single shot at American ground forces. They had simply been rendered strategically irrelevant, watching the war pass them by while they slowly starved. Wake Island's garrison of 4,000 received regular bombing but no invasion. The atoll that had briefly symbolized American resistance during the war's opening weeks now became a prison for its Japanese occupiers. 75% of those men would perish from starvation and disease before Japan surrendered. Ponap's 8,000 troops, Yap's 5,000, and Wolier's 4,000 all found themselves bypassed and irrelevant. They maintained defensive positions against an invasion that would never come, using up supplies that couldn't be replaced, slowly weakening from malnutrition and tropical diseases. The statistics revealed the strategy's brutal efficiency. Approximately 165,000 to 175,000 Japanese troops were neutralized through bypass and blockade at minimal American cost. These men consumed no American lives in ground combat. They tied down no Marine divisions. They delayed the advance toward Japan by not a single day, and approximately 50 to 60% would die from the siege conditions before surrender, a mortality rate approaching that of major battles, but achieved through isolation rather than assault. The Mariana Islands campaign in June through August 1944 demonstrated that the bypass strategy did not eliminate the need for major amphibious operations when strategic objectives demanded them. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam lay 1,200 to 1,500 miles from Japan, well within range of the new B-29 Superfortress bombers. Their capture would enable the strategic bombing campaign that would burn Japan's cities and ultimately force surrender. These islands couldn't be bypassed. They had to be taken, regardless of cost. The assault on Saipan, beginning June 15, 1944, committed 71,000 American troops against 30,000 Japanese defenders. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito commanded a defense in depth that made full use of Saipan's mountainous terrain. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who had commanded the carrier force at Pearl Harbor 3 years earlier, now found himself directing ground defenses as his career came full circle. To defeat. The battle consumed 24 days of savage fighting. On July 6th, Saito ordered the largest banzai charge of the Pacific War. 4,000 Japanese troops attacked American lines in a suicide assault that killed over 1,000 Americans before 4,300 attackers died. American casualties for the entire Saipan operation reached 16,500, including approximately 3,100 killed. The Japanese lost essentially their entire garrison of 30,000. Both Saito and Nagumo committed suicide as the battle ended. The cost was terrible, but the strategic value justified every casualty. From Saipan's airfields, B-29 bombers could reach Tokyo. But while ground forces fought for Saipan, the carrier battle that had enabled the entire island-hopping strategy reached its climax offshore. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded the Japanese Mobile Fleet, the combined fleet's last major carrier force. 9 carriers embarked. Approximately 450 aircraft, supported by 300 land-based planes. Ozawa sailed to destroy the American invasion force, confident that the combined fleet's final gamble would succeed. He faced Mitscher's Task Force 58 at its peak strength. 15 carriers operated 900 aircraft. 7 fast battleships provided anti-aircraft firepower and surface striking power that had never been available to earlier carrier forces. The supporting screen of cruisers and destroyers deployed the most advanced radar in the world, capable of detecting enemy aircraft at ranges that gave defenders precious minutes to prepare. And American pilots flying the new Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighter possessed both superior training and a superior aircraft. The training disparity tells much of the story. The average American naval aviator in mid-1944 had over 500 hours of flight time. Japanese pilots averaged 40 hours. The Americans trained against full-strength opposition in realistic combat scenarios. The Japanese trained with fuel shortages, limiting flight hours, and experienced instructors already dead in combat. When battle was joined, the outcome was never in doubt. On June 19, 1944, Ozawa launched 4 massive strikes at the American fleet. American radar detected the first raid at extreme range, over 150 miles from the carriers. Combat air patrol fighters intercepted 70 miles out. Of 68 attacking aircraft in the first raid, 42 were shot down before any reached American ships. The survivors achieved no significant damage. The second raid committed 107 aircraft. 97 were destroyed. Only 6 attacked American carriers, achieving no significant damage. The third raid encountered similar devastation. The fourth raid survivors attempting to land at a Rota field on Guam were slaughtered by fighters that followed them to the airfield and caught them in landing pattern when they were most vulnerable. A pilot from the carrier Lexington, debriefing after the day's combat, made an observation that became history. "Why, hell," he said, "it was just like an old-time turkey shoot down home." The name stuck. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot entered naval history as the battle that destroyed Japanese carrier aviation forever. While American fighters massacred Japanese air groups, American submarines delivered strategic killing blows to the Japanese fleet itself. USS Albacore torpedoed Japan's newest and largest carrier, Taiho. Poor damage control allowed aviation gasoline vapors to spread through the ship. The resulting explosion sank Taiho with 1,650 of 2,150 crew. USS Kavala put 3 torpedoes into veteran carrier Shokaku, the Pearl Harbor survivor. Aviation fuel fires destroyed the ship, killing 1,263. On June 20th, Mitscher launched 226 aircraft at extreme range against the retreating Japanese fleet. Carrier Hiyo took torpedo hits and sank. Multiple other vessels suffered damage. The American strike aircraft returned after dark, many running critically low on fuel. Mitscher made a decision that demonstrated his character and his understanding of what made American naval aviation effective. He ordered every ship in the task force to turn on lights despite submarine threat. Carriers illuminated their decks. Destroyers shone searchlights skyward. 80 aircraft were lost to ditching and crash landings, but rescue operations over the following days recovered approximately 75% of aircrews. Mitscher valued his pilots more than operational security, and his pilots knew it. The Battle of the Philippine Sea destroyed Japanese carrier power. American losses totaled 123 aircraft and 109 dead. Japanese losses reached between 550 and 645 aircraft destroyed, 3 carriers sunk, and approximately 2,987 dead. 90% of Japan's rebuilt carrier air groups were annihilated in 2 days. The few surviving pilots could barely fill one light carrier's complement. Japan would never again operate carriers offensively. At Leyte Gulf, 4 months later, Japanese carriers served as decoys, their decks empty of aircraft. The kamikaze suicide tactics that followed represented Japan's admission that conventional naval aviation no longer existed. The capability to project air power from carriers, which had dominated Pacific naval warfare since Pearl Harbor, had become an exclusively American capability. The completion of the Marianas Campaign with the capture of Tinian and Guam gave the United States what it needed most: B-29 bases within range of Japan. Tinian's North Field would launch the atomic bomb missions against Hiroshima and Nagasaki 13 months later. But the bases also enabled the conventional strategic bombing campaign that burned 67 Japanese cities and killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. Japan's industrial capacity collapsed. Its merchant fleet, already decimated by submarine warfare, could no longer sustain the home islands. The war was effectively over, though the killing would continue for another year. Japanese commanders' testimony after the war revealed their shock at American strategy and industrial capacity. Admiral Somu Toyota, who assumed combined fleet command after Admiral Menichi Koga's death in March 1944, provided extensive statements to the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. He stated what every Japanese officer knew but couldn't counter. The Americans had adequate raw materials, bountiful resources, tremendous production capacity, and carried out production plans according to schedule. He compared Japan's 6 million tons annual steel production to America's 80 to 100 million tons. The disparity wasn't just significant, it was overwhelming. Admiral Osami Nagano, when asked by the Privy Council whether Japan's defense perimeter could be held, expressed pessimism even in late 1943. The Navy would do its best, he said, but could not promise success. Too much depended on fortune, and fortune was not favoring Japan. The bypass strategy succeeded because American industrial production made continuous offensive operations possible. In 1943 alone, United States naval production exceeded the total wartime output of all other major powers combined. Aircraft production in 1944 reached 100,752 planes, nearly double Japan's entire wartime production of 58,822. The Essex-class construction program delivered a new fleet carrier every 2 months during 1943 and 1944. All 9 Independence-class light carriers commissioned in 1943 alone. Aircraft production matched carrier construction. Grumman produced 12,275 F-6F Hellcats. At peak production, one Hellcat rolled off the assembly line every hour around the clock. The Hellcat achieved a 19-to-1 kill ratio and accounted for 75% of all Navy aerial victories. Pilot training proved equally decisive. The Navy produced 61,658 pilots from 1942 to 1945. Japan trained 24,000 total. By late 1944, American pilots graduated with minimum 525 hours flight time. Japanese pilots received 40 hours. The logistics revolution enabled everything else. Service Squadron 10, commissioned January 15, 1944 under Commodore Worrell Reed Carter, grew to command several hundred vessels, providing fuel, ammunition, provisions, aircraft replacements, and repairs at sea. Task Force 58 could remain at sea indefinitely, never returning to Pearl Harbor. Ulithi Atoll, seized September 22 through 23, 1944, became the world's largest naval base. Its lagoon could anchor over 700 ships simultaneously, more than Pearl Harbor's capacity. The fast carrier task force operated for nearly 2 years without returning to mainland ports, sustaining pressure that Japan's interior line strategy could never counter. The island-hopping campaign achieved what conventional strategies could not. By November 1944, American forces had pierced Japan's defensive perimeter, established bomber bases in the Marianas, and positioned themselves for the final assaults on Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Approximately 165,000 to 175,000 Japanese troops remained trapped on bypassed islands, dying from starvation and disease while threatening no American operations. The strategy demonstrated that modern air and naval power could neutralize heavily fortified positions without the bloody ground assaults that had characterized warfare since the dawn of human conflict. And it was made possible by one critical advantage that Japan could never overcome. American industry produced war material faster than Japan could destroy it, trained pilots faster than combat could kill them, and built ships faster than submarines could sink them. Admiral Toyota understood the truth. Japan might compete for a year or so, he acknowledged, but after that it would become extremely difficult. The island-hopping campaign ensured that after that arrived far sooner than Japan had ever imagined possible. When Mitscher stood on Yorktown's bridge that February morning in 1944, he wasn't just launching another carrier strike. He was demonstrating that the rules of warfare had fundamentally changed. The heavily fortified bases that were supposed to delay American advances for years could be neutralized in days. The garrisons that were supposed to bleed American forces white could be starved into irrelevance. The defensive perimeter that was supposed to make conquest impossible could be bypassed and ignored. The attack on Truk proved it. Operation Hailstone, as the raid was designated, eliminated one of Japan's most important forward bases in 48 hours. The Gibraltar of the Pacific fell without being invaded. 40,000 troops became prisoners of their own positions, slowly starving while the war moved on without them. And the lesson was learned across the Central Pacific. Rabaul, Wake, Ponape, Yap, Woliai, and dozens of other fortified positions would share Truk's fate. Bypassed, isolated, forgotten. Nimitz's vision and Mitscher's execution had created something unprecedented in naval warfare. A fleet that could project power anywhere in the Pacific, remain at sea indefinitely, overwhelm any defensive position through sheer weight of air power, and advance the American timetable toward Tokyo regardless of what defensive positions Japan had prepared. The carriers had become a moving front line, a fleet in being that threatened every position and could strike anywhere, making every Japanese defensive calculation obsolete. The Japanese had built their strategy around making Americans pay for every island. Nimitz and Mitscher had simply refused to buy what Japan was selling. They took the islands that mattered and ignored everything else, letting time, starvation, and disease do the work that would have cost thousands of American lives. It was warfare by isolation, by overwhelming industrial capacity, by complete control of sea and air. And once the strategy proved its worth at Kwajalein and Truk, there was no going back. The path to Tokyo would be measured not in blood-soaked beaches, but in bypassed islands, not in ground conquered, but in Japanese forces rendered irrelevant. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, over 160,000 Japanese troops remained on bypassed islands, having never fired a shot at American ground forces. Their mortality rate approached 60%, achieved not through battle, but through isolation and starvation. It was brutal, it was efficient, and it saved countless American lives while accelerating the advance toward Japan by months or even years. The legacy of Nimitz's bypass strategy and Mitscher's carrier operations extended far beyond World War II. They demonstrated that modern naval power, properly organized and supplied, could project force at distances and with sustainability that previous generations of military planners would have considered impossible. They proved that strategic objectives didn't always require frontal assault, that heavily fortified positions could become strategic liabilities for defenders if attackers simply refused to attack them. They showed that industrial capacity and logistics could be as decisive as tactical brilliance or individual courage. And they established the aircraft carrier as the dominant capital ship of modern naval warfare, a position carriers would hold for the rest of the 20th century and beyond. The battleship, which had dominated naval thinking for generations, had become a supporting vessel. The carrier was now supreme. Mitscher's Task Force 58 had proven it beyond any doubt. The largest carrier battle in history, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, had eliminated Japanese carrier aviation in 2 days. No battleship engagement, no matter how decisive, could have achieved comparable strategic results in comparable time. That February morning in 1944, when Mitscher's fighters roared off Yorktown's deck and headed toward Truk, they were carrying more than bombs and ammunition. They were carrying proof that warfare had entered a new era, an era where air power projected from carriers could achieve objectives that would have required massive amphibious assaults just years earlier. The Gibraltar of the Pacific was about to fall, and tens of thousands of American lives were about to be saved because one admiral asked a simple but revolutionary question. What if we just don't attack the strongest bases at all? What if we simply go around them and let them starve? That question, and the capability to execute the strategy it implied, changed how wars would be fought for generations to come. If you found this deep dive into one of World War II's most revolutionary strategic developments fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. There are dozens more stories from the Pacific War waiting to be explored, stories of innovation, sacrifice, and strategic brilliance that deserve to be remembered. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.